So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Thanks for joining us today for the virtual reading group. Let me just take 1 second for a public service announcement. I'm sure many of you have seen too many of our emails in your boxes this week. This is our fund drive, not fund drive, our membership drive. If you need to renew or haven't renewed yet, this would be a great time to do so. Membership not only allows you to be in this group, but also attend our conferences. Amor Mundi is free, but be part of the community that you all are now a part of, and I really do appreciate your being part of that community. But we do need to fund what we do, and I appreciate you guys joining if you can. So we have lots of great membership levels and perks and joint agreements, joint memberships and subscriptions. So if you can and you haven't, this would be a great next day or so to do that. So thank you very much. Okay, so let's begin. Again, this is a book of essays that we're reading called Essays in Understanding. We're reading a series of, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, a series of essays that Arendt wrote and published in 1944 and 45, and that continues this week as well. One thing that we should all remember is that Arendt was, at this point, poor, and she was writing to make a living. She was a journalist or a freelance journalist, and a lot of these are reviews and essays she writes for that. Some are obviously more inspired than others. I don't think we should seek to make them all so important, and yet. What's amazing about Arendt, at least in my estimation, is that almost no matter what she writes about, something of gravitas and something of meaning comes out. And so, today, the first and last essay that we read, the first on Dilthey as a philosopher and historian, and then the last on Power, Politics, Triumphs, are reviews. Both reviews of books she doesn't think very much of. The book on Dilthey by H.A. Hodges, she thinks gets a ton wrong, primarily that it looks to Dilthey more as a philosopher than as a historian. And she finds what's interesting about Dilthey is that he's an historian of ideas. Dilthey is not widely read today. I actually have a chapter on him in my first book, or a chapter inspired by him. He's someone I've really found exciting to read. The main aspect of Dilthey that is of interest to Arendt and to many of us is his attempt to put what in German is called die Geisteswissenschaften, which in English traditionally is translated as the social sciences, but Arendt doesn't want to translate it that way. We might call it the social studies. Why? Because the word Geistes is spirit. It's actually the human studies. The spirit, the Geist, is the human spirit. And Wissenschaften comes from the word to know. So it's the knowledge of the human spirit. And for Arendt, it's important to make a distinction between science and Wissenschaft. Now, let's be clear. We translate Wissenschaft in English as science, but that's because we don't have another word for it. And for Arendt, that is a mistake. The Wissenschaften is not the Scientia. It's not the attempt to know the truth of something. it's to know the meaning of something, to know what it is in its meaningfulness. And so what makes Dilthey important, and the reason he's such an interesting thinker, is that he studies history to look into history to find the meaning of history for our time. And in doing so, he separates history, which is about finding meaning, from the natural sciences, which is about knowing the truth of things or the world. And I mean, just a biographical footnote, but one that I think is meaningful, is that Hannah Arendt's husband, Heinrich Blücher, taught at Bard for 17 years, Bard, where the Hannah Arendt Center is based. And he, at Bard, we don't have departments, we have divisions. And the division in which I am based is called the Social Studies Division. And it's called Social Studies, whereas at almost any other school it would be called Social Sciences, because Blücher insisted that the study of human Wissenschaften was not a science, and that we should not make the mistake of calling it a science. And so that, I'm probably the only one in my division who cares about this distinction, but it is one that for Arendt and for Blücher and for Dilthey mattered. The core of the argument here is that the Geisteswissenschaften, the knowledge-oriented, meaning-oriented study of the human spirit, is based in an act of interpretation. And as an act of interpretation, what it interprets are events, experiences, Erlebnisse, really life meaningful events that have happened to other people. And in this case, the historian, the Geisteswissenschaftler, and she uses historian as the main category for all humanistic inquiry. The historian is like an artist. He gives or she gives access to and expresses a meaningful experience that one does not have in one's own life, but finds in interpreting the lives of others. So the example she gives is, Dilthey writes this extraordinary book on the theologian Schleiermacher, who makes religious studies, theology, brings it into the modern era, but he does so by taking out faith and taking out belief in God. Schleiermacher, like most modern religious people, Arendt argues, or Dilthey argues, is not religious. But what he does is he transforms religion from its old idea as a matter of belief or faith to a kind of feeling of dependency, to something that has in the world. And in doing that, Schleiermacher turns himself into an artist who understands this feeling of dependency and need for religious authority. Anyway, that's what she, again, doesn't think much of the book, not a huge fan of Dilthey, and yet I think finds something meaningful in it. The last short piece on power politics, again, her arguments, she thinks the book is interesting in one regard, which is that it talks about the need for a federation in Europe after the war, which is, as we know, something Arendt cared deeply about. And yet she thought the book was wildly outdated and no longer relevant because, for the most part, it doesn't understand two things. One of which is that Russia is not going to let Eastern Europe become a federative state because it wants to control it. And the more important thing is that it doesn't understand that power is what drives politics, that power wants nothing so much as to become even bigger. Arendt's interest in federations and federalism is precisely because, as she says in On Revolution, the only way to fight centralized power is through federalism, through creating multiple smaller power sources that can all oppose each other. And yet what she knows even here in 1945, as she's writing is that power wants to get bigger. power wants to grow. This is the Nietzschean idea, Friedrich Nietzsche's idea, that the will to power is the will to constantly overcome, to get stronger, to get bigger. And she understands that. And that's her worry. And that's one of the reasons she thinks the US Constitution was so remarkable, because it understood that and tried to create as many barriers to the centralization of power that could be created. For those of you who've read On Revolution, you know that in the end, she thinks that failed. And we're seeing the example, the evidence of that failure today with the increasing and deeply dangerous increasing power of the central government in the United States. The two slightly longer essays in the middle are potentially more meaty for us to talk about. The first one, on the seeds of a fascist international, is again something she's written about a lot. We've already talked about some of these issues in other essays. It's going to come back in The Origins of Totalitarianism. But very briefly, the thesis of this essay is that as long as anti-Semitism survives, and because anti-Semitism is in many ways a foundational aspect of fascism and fascist political organization, so as long as anti-Semitism survives, seeds of fascism will survive. This is her argument here. Namely that, if you say, oh, well, fascism is gone, but there's still anti-Semitism, but don't worry, she says, no, wherever there's anti-Semitism, you should worry. I think there's a couple things to point out. One is, by anti-Semitism, she does not mean discrimination against Jews. She does not mean hatred against Jews, right? These are fundamental insights of Hannah Arendt's that it's very hard for us today, I think, to make sense of. I've probably told some of you this 20 or 30 times, and yet I have to always remind myself and you of this fact. Anti-Semitism is not discrimination against a minority. Anti-Semitism is a political movement. And it's a political movement that she says is the great danger to democracy and a foundation of fascism. It began, she says, at a very particular point. I mean, hatred of Jews and discrimination of Jews goes back thousands of years. Anti-Semitism began in the 1880s with the rise of specifically internationalist anti-Semitic parties in Europe. And this is part of her argument also, that anti-Semitism is not a nationalist idea, it's an internationalist idea. And that the core of anti-Semitism as it emerged in Europe is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which everyone knew was a forgery. And yet, even though they knew it was a forgery, people believed it. Why? What was so, and this is the question she wants to ask, why is it that such a forgery like the Protocols of Zion, and this idea that the Jews have a world conspiracy based on racist or ethnic foundations, why is this believed? Why is this so important? Why are Jews the spark of fascism and Nazism? And her argument is that the protocols and this idea of the Jews was important for the Nazis because the Nazis thought it was great. They thought if the Jews can do it, why can't we? So the protocols were a model for what a successful racial group could accomplish, namely world domination. And the Nazis saw themselves as competing with the Jews. They actually, I mean, this is something you get if you actually have to read Nazi propaganda, which Arendt did a lot of, and I've had to do through her. The Nazis saw the Jews as as the most cunning and most brilliant competition for what they were. Now, yes, they also presented them as vermin and rats and things of that sort, but that's propaganda for non-initiates. And what she says is what the Nazis really took is this was a model, and that it can work. And so why is it that the model of a Jewish world conspiracy of internationalist racial origin became meaningful in the 1880s, right? That's the question she needs to ask in her work. And her answer is, in a sense, two. One is the loss of a kind of tradition and religion and meaning, an increasing loneliness in the world, created a vacuum in the late 19th century as the old order broke down. And out of this vacuum emerged a craving, a need for some new meaning. And the second reason that she's going to give here is that the nation state, which had from the 17th century up till the late 19th century really become the centerpiece of Europe, the nation state was breaking apart, was declining. This really happens after World War I. After World War I, you have two things emerge. One are minority peoples dispersed throughout Europe, and second, refugees. And the combination of minorities and refugees inside nation states means that the nation states were not nation states. So if you have Germany, inside Germany, there weren't just Germans. There were Jews, there were Poles, there were Gypsies or Roma. There were other people. And what she says is this gives the lie to the nation state, and it makes the nation state an impossibility, because as a state, the nation state's supposed to treat everyone equal. But if it's a nation state, it's supposed to give privilege to its national majority. And really what that means is you're going to create a state with first and second class citizens. First class citizens being the national majority, second class citizens being the minorities. And that's incompatible with the demand for equality, which comes along through the state. And so she says there's only two real solutions to the problem of the nation state has minorities in it. One is assimilation, and two is expulsion or murder. And that the nation state just ran into this problem and it couldn't solve it. The nation state could not solve the problem of minorities. And for Arendt, this was deadly. And it creates a sense amongst people that the nation state has no solutions, is flat-footed, is heavy-footed, or she says has its feet in clay, and that it can't deal with the problems of its time. And that she says the great danger is that democracies will continue to operate with a nationalist conception, renouncing any kind of ideological strategy that will argue against anti-Semitism or racism. And they will lose, because anti-Semitism and racism have an advantage over nationalism, right? That's an argument that runs through all of Arendt's writing in this period, up until the mid-1950s. And we have to understand that the advantage of racism, anti-Semitism, and communism, which she will translate as classism, namely the proletariat over the bourgeoisie, they're all isms. The advantage of these isms is that they see power as a struggle amongst classes and races. And thus they're willing to do anything. Remember, power politics. They're willing to do anything to win for their class or their race. Whereas Democrats, who are trying to say we're all equal and are trying to live within the rules, are not. And what she says is democracies, insofar as they try and hold on to this nation state and nationalist conception, are fated to lose. And in such a world, she says, fascism will be useful and will use racist ideologies to argue in a way that outbids Democrats who argue for equality of all peoples. That fascists will embrace white supremacist ideological strategy, she writes in 1945. And it will claim to pursue these racial interests or the class interests of communism above national interests. And people in nation states will flock to the class and race interests over national interests because they find national interests to be fake, to be unconvincing, and that's her argument. And out of this breakdown of the national interest, of a feeling of real meaningful national identity, there's a need for a fundamental need for a new truth, a new ideology, a new craving for certainty that ideologies, namely racist and communist or classist ideologies, can offer. She ends this essay with by just announcing at the very last line. She says, "These are the perils of tomorrow." Right? She thinks that she says, as the nation state restores itself, fascism and classism are going to come back because they will win. That's her argument. And she says, unquestionably, fascism has once been defeated, but we are far from having completely eradicated this arch evil of our time, for its roots are strong, and they are called anti-Semitism, racism, and imperialism. So anti-Semitism, racism, and imperialism, by the way, was the first title she gave to her book, which later became The Origins of Totalitarianism. And the arguments and what they are, anti-Semitism, racism, and imperialism, are ideas that go against the nation state, right? Racism is against the nation state because it puts certain people above others in the nation state. Anti-Semitism, in the same thing, an international world dominating ideology. And imperialism, insofar as it seeks world domination of great power politics rather than local national politics. Finally, the essay Christianity and Revolution, which is actually a fascinating essay, briefly argues that there's two kind of neo-Catholicisms that are emerging. One is a Catholicism without faith, which she sees as conservative. It sees the church. We don't believe in Christ. We don't believe in God, but we believe in the authority and the order of the church. And we believe in it because we have contempt for democracy and we want authoritarian rule, and the church is our model for authoritarian rule. But there's another neo-Catholicism, one that she obviously is quite attracted to, which also seeks an escape from the world of democracy, but in the opposite way. It says that our current world lacks democracy. It's a plutocratic world, and it sees the plutocracy for what it was. It sought freedom and reason for the people, and it was based upon a deep hatred of the bourgeoisie and bourgeois society. It saw thus a distinction between poverty, which it sees as a virtue, and destitution, which it sees as a modern plague. And so what she says is, look, the problem today is that we all want people to be middle class. And in trying to do so, we end up justifying all sorts of evil because we're bourgeois. And what she says is actually it'd be better to live in poverty, or that's what the neo-Catholics say. And I think Arendt has a lot of sympathy for them. And she quotes Pegway, who says poverty is a virtue, but destitution is a modern plague. Bernanon, who says that we need to have knights who are untouched by the secret desire for necessary evil. And then my personal favorite here is Chesterton, who argues that against vegetarians, because vegetarians will not go without gardens and gorgeous rooms, which the poor man can't enjoy, but they abolish meat because the poor like meat. These are critiques against modern bourgeois ideologies that she finds attractive here in Catholicism. The last point I'll make about this, and then we'll open it up for conversation, is that what she also found attractive about the Christian neo-Catholicism is that it embraces the Christian doctrine of limitation, and thus the inhumanity of modern technology, and psychology and biology. all three, psychology, technology, and biology, are mobilized in the modern world to turn man into a superman, right? Biologically, turn him into someone who can live forever. Technically, give us unheard of powers through implants or our iPhones, and psychologically to get rid of our demons, to make us happy where we're not supposed to be happy. And so these attempts to create happiness and unlimited happiness for man are for her, are for these neo-Christians, and I think for Arendt also, deeply inhuman and counter to the human condition. So anyway, these are, again, four sort of diverse texts. If you have questions, the easiest way to do it is to raise your hand under your name. If you click on participants down below and go to your name, you can raise your hand, and you can also ask questions in the chat box. I see there's already a lot of both. But let me start so I don't have to talk so much longer by asking Paul to ask the first question. Hi, Paul.
Hi. So I wanted to respond to your comment about Arendt seeing you're absolutely right in On Revolution, centralization of government in America and lamenting it. It's a question about what Arendt would say now. She did not live quite long enough to read Richard Barnett's book, Global Reach, about multinational corporations. She also was not as interested as she might have been in her writing in the Global South. But the emergence of multinational corporations that resemble sort of the East India Company, that are more than commercial entities, that seek more than control of markets, that are pursuing sort of a maximum of control of human activity. That, I think, anyone today would say is the biggest negator of nation states. Even more, although that may change very rapidly, than the flow of refugees. And then I think she would be saying to us today that we should pay a special attention to refugees and how refugees are discussed, because we are witnessing, I am witnessing, in a very brief period of time, populist refugee and immigrant bashing, far-right political parties and governments sort of appearing here, there, and everywhere. And when we think of Trump and we think of the refugees packed at up to 9 times the capacity into for-profit detention centers in America, I think Arendt would really want us to think about refugees and nations and the climate crisis and multinational corporations like the fossil fuel companies.
Right. Okay.
And ask those questions about national sovereignty with her kind of penetrating thought.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Great question. And, in a way, I hope that these are the issues that we're going to really focus on today. I mean, whatever you guys are interested in, but the question about the nation state is, I think, one that Arendt identified 70 years ago and is still with us. And, whether you're thinking about refugees or multinational corporations, we're thinking about populism, we're thinking about racism or anti-Semitism today. I think one of the biggest questions is, what are nation states doing? Are they being revitalized? Are they fading away? What are we seeing? And so a couple of thoughts to respond to Paul. One is that Arendt makes a distinction between politics and economics. That's central to her thinking. And economics, she says, is based upon a law of infinite growth, right? Company grows, capitalists grow, economies grow. Politics is necessarily based on stability and limitation. So we have a people, whether it's a Jewish people or the Amish people or the American people or whatever it is. And in order to keep ourselves as a people, we have to set limits, moral limits, religious limits, ethical limits, political limits on what we can do. And she says one of the problems with the modern era is that the rise of early global companies, imperialist endeavors like the East Indian Tea Company, couldn't be controlled by national political boundaries, and so politics, by necessity, became imperialist because it was driven by economic logic, not political logic. And this loss of political logic and the rise of economic logic for her first the ability of political organizations to create limited political entities that now look, limited political entities have advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage we all know. They can be racist and they can be discriminatory and they can be awful, but they're limited. The advantage, though, is they're limited and they don't seek world domination. And at some point, they actually do try and treat people within their borders or in their group as equal. And so Arendt is struggling throughout, from the 40s up until her death, with this insight that on the one hand, the political organization of the national state is no longer up to the job of dealing with multinational corporations and no longer up to the job of dealing with refugees. And yet, what's going to replace it? She's not a prophet. She doesn't have answers. She over and over again in her life comes back to this question of federations, and in the 60s, when she writes the book on revolution, she looks most closely at it, and what she says is the American example of federalism, which of course allowed for unholy slavery and other discriminations in different countries, different states, and allowed for prejudices to be solidified, in regions and states and localities. As awful and terrible as that was, she says it was the one thing that prevented the country from becoming what she called a nation state. She thought the United States was the one example in the world of a state that wasn't a nation state because it didn't have a nation. Now, I think, there's criticisms. Not many people have written about her on this, but I think the best criticism of Arendt on this is that it became a white nation state, right? And this is the argument that many people are making more recently, usually not talking about Arendt. And she didn't see that, right? She saw it as a federalist principle, and there was no one state. By the time of the 1940s and 1950s and 60s, when she's writing on revolution, she thinks it has ceased to be a federal state and it's become largely a nation state. And, she doesn't call it white explicitly, but she thinks it's become sort of a somewhat dangerous capitalist, imperialist nation state. But these are the questions she grapples with, Paul and everyone else. And I think one of the questions that confronts us today is, to what extent are nation states our hope, right? Can we, are we going to resist things we don't like, populism, racism, multinationals, refugees, by strengthening nation states? Or are we going to, in some way, uh, uh, have to find other political sources? And, for the last 50 or 70 years, we keep coming back to the nation state largely because we don't have anything else. Nothing else has emerged. And yet, what Arendt is telling us, as long as we continue to rely on the nation state, we're relying on basically something that's no longer possible, no longer workable. And as long as we do that, we are in danger of other movements that are more appealing and answer the cravings of people better. We're in danger that they will emerge, and new fascisms, new communisms, new isms will emerge and undo the democratic nature, or the somewhat democratic nature of so-called nation states. That's the problem she faces. I don't think she has a great solution to it, except, again, her solution that we need to, the only way she thinks to fight power is not by trying to limit power, but by multiplying it. And the way to do that is by creating constitutional and institutional power sources, states, localities. I mean, look, if you're worried about what's happening in Portland and Chicago, the answer is these states have national guards. These states have power. The question is, will they use it? And, I think they should. But, obviously that could bring about a constitutional crisis. But regardless, that's how I think she thinks about it. And I think that's the question we need to engage in. Okay? Do you wanna add something quickly, Paul?
Maybe this, that in her 1958 book, The Human Condition, Arendt makes it very clear that she thinks the consumer economy is an ecocide in the making, that fusing labor to work is ecocidal. That in that sense, I think, although she didn't really pursue it very well, she's seeing a kind of thoughtlessness in the sphere of commerce, and its capacity to overwhelm anything else, which I think is very much what we're living with. But I thought everything you said was to the point.
Yeah, thank you. I think the chapter on consumer culture in the Human Condition is deeply important and fascinating. It comes out of her critique of the elevation of life as the highest good, happiness as the highest good, and the problem is, she says, that when we no longer have higher values, whether it's religion or God or nation or whatever that we believe in, we have nothing else. All we want to do is make ourselves happy. Consumption leads to more consumption, and that's where it leads, not to a kind of nirvana that Marx had predicted. Marx predicted that if we all had a certain amount of money, we would be happy and we'd do hobbies and we'd fish and play bridge with each other. And she says that's not what happens. What happens is people consume more and more, and they're never satisfied. But yeah, those are important parts. Margaret, you're up. You want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So my question, Roger, is that it was either 2 or 3 years ago at the fall Arendt conference at Bard. There was a paper given by a presenter whose name I can't remember. I'm hoping you can, because I kept thinking of his thesis while I was reading particularly the piece on anti-Semitism and fascism. And to condense it as simply as I can, his thesis was that anti-Semitism and racism have to be inextricably linked, because if you have a view that an entire group, by virtue of race, is somehow less than you, then how is it essentially that you're scared of them? How could they get over on you? How could they win? And so therefore you kind of need this other group, the worldwide dominators, to be organizing it and getting it going and making things happen. Now, obviously, he was much more erudite about presenting it, but the gist of it was that, and that kept reverberating through my head as I was reading this, because, I think that, I mean, I don't know about other people, but one of the discussions then and things that I've heard from people I know and in the media and read and seen is an insistence on specifying, group by group, who is at the other end of what attack. And instead of putting, thank you, Paul, putting the whole thing in the larger context that I think she's trying to discuss. So I don't know if you remember
Yeah.
that presenter. Yeah.
Yeah, it was actually at this year's at the last conference.
Was that recent?
It was Eric Ward.
Okay.
Eric Ward is a brilliant and wonderful activist. He's at the Western States Center for Prejudice. I forget the exact name, but he's one of the leading authorities on racism and anti-Semitism in the country. And he has, one of the things he's dedicated his life to is studying white supremacy. And one of the aspects of his argument, as you rightly reconstructed it, Margaret, is that if you go to white supremacist websites and you go to white supremacist meetings, you'll realize that often as much, if not more, of the rhetoric is anti-Semitic rather than it is purely racist. And in fact, what he says is that the white supremacists, when they were confronted with civil rights in the 1960s, simply could not accept that African Americans had won this battle on their own and that were to be given their rights. And they said, we know the answer. It was the Jews. And their organizations are profoundly anti-Semitic in the way they are constructed and seen. So he's done really important work in this regard. Again, I don't think the point is to see it as a hierarchy, right? The point is, and this is Arendt's point, is that what anti-Semitism, the reason it was so important as a seed of fascism was because it was internationalist and because it was a conspiracy. And what I think that helps us understand is that again, remember, she makes a distinction between discrimination against Jews and anti-Semitism. There's the political organization of anti-Semitism, which leads to fascism, and then there's discrimination. What Eric Ward says is that there is discrimination and prejudice against Black Americans. Clearly, I mean, he lives it. But what he says is that if you actually look at the political organization of white supremacist organizations, they're less about racism in Black-white racism and more about anti-Semitism. And the reason is because anti-Semitism provides them with a conspiracy theory and provides them with an internationalist conspiracy theory that allows them to organize politically against the nation state, against the state that they see as a state that supports civil rights. And that's an important distinction. And that's why today, and that was why we had this conference last year on anti-Semitism and racism, or racism and anti-Semitism, to try and articulate the way that racism and anti-Semitism actually work together politically in that regard. That was the sort of thesis that I had in having the conference on that theme.
So, and to piggyback on that, and some of the prior discussion you were just having with Paul, it seems to me that it incorporates, I mean, we can think of several specific instances, whether it's George Soros or Michael Bloomberg or other people such as that. It incorporates the, classism or classicism, whatever I'm trying to say, debate, because you now have, as the, purported heads of these international conspiracies, these, modern day industrialists, not bound to a nation state, but sweeping the globe by virtue of their corporate interests and financial interests. And they provide a very handy sort of figurehead for all of that theorizing. Because, I mean, realistically, if you're sitting in, I mean, I live in a small town, and if you're a local in a small town, you don't grow up knowing who George Soros is. This doesn't have any effect on your daily life, unless this is offered, to your point, as a nice, simple, explanatory, device.
Yeah. No, I think that's really smart. I mean, I was really taken on pages 143 to 144 of the Seeds of Fascist International essay, where she says that that the problem is, how do we respond to a world politics when the nation state is under retreat? And she says the easiest way is that we see world politics as the super complicated, recondite bodies, and we see them as a conspiracy. And so we embrace dramatically simple hypotheses of a global conspiracy of our own. Think about the wild spread of conspiracy theories in the last decade. I mean, this QAnon thing is something we all have to deal with, right? Which is now becoming ever more widely accepted amongst large numbers of people in this country. But that's what she's talking about, and that's the aspect of Judaism she's talking about. Thank you, Stephen. You're up next.
Thanks, Roger. Thanks for putting in a word about Dilthey, who's one of my favorites out there, and I will be now inspired to read that chapter in your book.
Well, it's a chapter on the Allgemeines Landrecht, and Dilthey is one of the only people who's ever written a book on the Allgemeines Landrecht, the Prussia Allgemeines Landrecht. It's a bit erudite, or recondite, so I don't know if you really want to do that, Stephen, but so you go.
I'm a bear for punishment, so I might.
There you go.
I was curious about Arendt saying about Dilthey, and I don't mean to take us down a side road, because obviously the momentum of this discussion is on some other topics, but she would say that the reliving experiences in Dilthey's sense has produced some great achievements, she says, but it's not philosophy.
Yeah.
Do you yourself agree with that? I think it is philosophy. It's about epistemology and a different way of knowing, and that should count as philosophy and not just a different sort of historical method or something like that. Would you care to comment on that, Roger?
Well, again, we can get into semantic arguments. When she says it's not philosophy, I think what she means is it's not seeking a truth. Maybe you read this in conjunction with the last page of the essay we read today on Christianity and Revolution, where she talks about this married couple, the Raisa Maritain and the other one, I don't know his name, Jacques Maritain, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And says that while the the neo Catholics as journalists and polemicists were quite interesting and good. When they turned to philosophy, they were terrible.
Yeah.
And the reason is because they wanted certainty.
Yes. Yeah.
And that philosophy, to the extent it wants certainty, is the end of philosophy, and the end of, because it seeks a kind of truth. And I think, and yet I think much of philosophy is about truth in that way. Especially modern philosophy, as she would see it, modern analytic philosophy. What is it about Dilthey that makes him not so interesting as a philosopher? Because he didn't seek a system.
Yeah.
He was Heidegger also Arendt doesn't think of as a philosopher. And remember, Arendt doesn't think of herself as a philosopher.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
These are all people who saw the problem with philosophy is that philosophy sought systems, certainties, and truths. And what Heidegger and Arendt and Dilthey sought was meaning, not truth. Now, again, this is somewhat semantic. We can say, oh, well, that's what philosophy should be. It should be seeking meaning, not truth. But I think that's the ground for her saying that Dilthey was not a philosopher. He didn't seek a systematic truth. His whole approach was one of hermeneutic interpretation, not systematization or truth or certainty. So that's what I think is being said there. Is that fair?
I would just say that isn't there then some sort of commonality between Dilthey and Arendt?
Very much. I mean, Arendt, I think what Arendt loves about Dilthey, she doesn't think much of Hodge.
Yeah.
But what she likes about Dilthey is precisely his attempt to think the Geisteswissenschaften, the human studies, the human search for meaning. That's what she likes about him. What I think she found limiting about him is that he couldn't get beyond sort of just looking at history of the past and not actually looking at the present. She sees him as a romantic historian of the 19th century type, but doesn't see him as someone who's going to so she says that she says the main point about this art of reproduction, this is on 137, is that it enables one to share in experiences that are ordinarily beyond the bounds of an individual life and a specific historical time. It is this somehow parasitical attitude of life, I'm just skipping the quote from Hodges, which makes Dilthey's general reflections on history so highly characteristic of the spirit of the 19th century, in that it's parasitic. It looks back on history almost from a sense of loss. And that's where she, again, it's not that he's wrong or anything. She finds it incredibly compelling. And she reads Dilthey. I kept asking myself, why would she review this book? She obviously hated this book. I think she really likes Dilthey. And so she wanted to see what this, one of the first English translations was going to do with him. And she didn't think much of it. But for her, so Stephen, the difference is that when Arendt looks at the Holocaust or the American Revolution, she's not looking at it simply as a parasite to sort of see it within history. She's actually looking at it to tell the history of the present, and I think that's what she doesn't see in Dilthey.
Yeah, could be indeed. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I see in the chat there's another question about Dilthey by Andrew. So just because we're on it, I'll bring that up. Andrew, do you want to ask your question? Or you want me to just read it?
I can ask.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, ask it, Andrew.
I'm tip of the iceberg for this. I'm doing a research area on Hannah Arendt's judgment. So, I mean, the first part, because her concept of, I think she likes geniuses in the original sense, and then when you add like a boardroom full of people, it's the signature of the genius that she doesn't like. And so when Dilthey's describing the genius, is it sort of like where Hannah Arendt makes the distinction between like classical tyrannies and modern tyrannies? Is there like a classical genius and a modern genius? That was the first part of my question. And then the other part was just considering German philosophers around this. I did my philosophy master's paper on Schopenhauer, and so he's not mentioned a lot. But when it comes to how they perceive consciousness, when I was looking up on the Stanford encyclopedia on Dilthey before this, it kept bringing up the psychic nexus, and I hadn't really seen that anywhere in his contemporaries. So I was wondering why he used that kind of language and what that might have to do with genius.
I'm going to have to punt on that last part. I'm not sure what the psychic nexus is. If we look at the bottom of page 137, she says the artist is the prototype of man is an old topic. The difference between the older concepts and the 19th century genius worship that started with German Romanticism is marked. For the former, the old one, the artist was the supreme guarantee of man's creative capacities. So the fact that a Homer existed or a Michelangelo existed was simply an evident that man was like God, that man had divine in him. Whereas Romanticism, she says, already saw in art only the expression of experiences, and in the artist only a human being with more and more interesting experiences. So we lose that. Acknowledgement or insight into man as separate from and different from an animal. So if you want to look at the writing she does on genius and the human condition, Andrew, right, where she says that the dividing line between man and animal goes right through these questions of genius. Arendt has a view that what makes us human is our ability to do things that are memorable and that last and that can create stories and peoples and institutions and states. And that in order to do that, we have to be concerned with things like immortality. And that requires a belief that we have the ability to be immortal, to be like gods. She takes this seriously, and a lot of people don't want to read this into her work, but this is an essential part of her work. And so for her, genius has to be connected to the doing of great deeds that are worthy of being remembered, and thus our avenue not towards a kind of immortality in the sense that your soul lives forever, but immortality in the worldly sense that she talks about it, which is that your ideas will live forever. And that she takes seriously, and she thinks that the romantics, and she'll put Dilthey in this category, make genius too common and too easy, and don't connect genius anymore with a kind of immortality. They connect with a feeling of I feel good or feel different, right? But they don't connect it with God or with immortality or with things that are deserved to be remembered, and that's the difference.
Schopenhauer at the same point.
Same point as Arendt about genius.
When it came to, you get a lot of new books and a lot of good books, but good books generally aren't new because new books aren't new for very long.
Yeah.
Good books
Yeah,
are
no,
always good.
yeah, that's obviously a Nietzschean point as well. But there you go. Thank you. Thanks for the question. Jack, you're up next. Can you unmute?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So this is going to be a little complicated because I'm trying to weave together several different ideas. But my focus is the final lines of the article in the Fascist International, namely that the trouble for the future, for her future, our present, is a combination of racism, imperialism, and anti-Semitism. So of the three, racism and anti-Semitism are about relationships between people. But imperialism is about economics. That imperialism is a kind of expression of those.
Can I just stop you there for one thing? I don't think she thinks anti-Semitism is about a relationship between people. She thinks Jew hatred is about a relationship between people. She thinks anti-Semitism is a political conspiracy and political organizational idea. I just want to.
Okay, and that's the way I think about it too. And she is the one who has persuaded me of that. I just wanted to make a distinction between those two and imperialism, which has an economic base, and which is not today generally the subject of conversations about either race or anti-Semitism, but of course is present there. And so, and that's really the point that I want to make here. So in our present day, the question arises, is there such a thing as fascist international? Is there a Nazi conspiracy, for example, today? And I think Steve Greenleaf addressed this in the chat, where he says there doesn't seem to be a Nazi resurgence, and refers to some films like The Boys from Brazil and The Quill Memorandum, basically saying that it's not present in our culture. There was a film about 20 years ago with Ryan Gosling called The Believer, in which the absolutely best description of anti-Semitism in the sense of Jew hatred is expressed perfectly. And by going through all of the different ways in which it gets expressed, he ends up saying, why do we hate them? We hate them because we hate them. But that explanation is just an explanation. The source has got to be something other than self-feeding hatred. Yeah. And we've talked about Eric Ward and how he sees anti-Semitism as the underlying tool being used by the white supremacist conspiracy today to explain their current position, which is that they have to accept that Black people in America have actually achieved things, starting with the civil rights. He starts with the civil rights movement, but of course we know that the consequence of the civil rights movement was a great expansion of Black culture and Black development in America, to a point really where now we're seeing a tremendous assertion of it. Where I'm going is about, and I just want to say that all of this is prelude to what I think about the current struggle regarding immigration. Immigration to me today is the expression of the Fascist International. And it's not that there are people wearing Nazi armbands in Hungary, Britain, Germany, France, America, Indonesia, China, and so on, where there are very strong expressions, there are very strong movements against immigration and expressions of nationalism. Nationalism in our world today, I see as the resistance against the internationalization that has been developed economically by the multinationals, who are the current expression of imperialism, and that this focus on protecting national purity, which is present in all of those instances, and which is expressed as in some places as racism, and in some places as anti-Semitism, but everywhere as anti-immigration. That is a refusal to permit people who will muddy our purity into the country. And I see all of this as the current form of the fascist international. That is, that the resistance to immigration in all of those countries is a current expression of all three of the pillars of the fight, the forms of the fascist international.
Thanks, Jag. That's a really rich question, quite insightful. We've largely, because of what we read today, which is what Arendt's writing in 1945, we focused on racism and anti-Semitism more so than imperialism, right? And so you make that distinction, and I think it's an important distinction to make, because if you read what she writes 5 years later when she publishes The Origins of Totalitarianism, imperialism takes on ever more weight in her understanding of the origins of totalitarianism and what she's here calling fascism. She'll change it to totalitarianism. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's not just, there's 5 chapters in the imperialism section of the book, but I would argue that one of the central reasons is the way that imperialism, which is about expansion, but is also about occupying and controlling for economic benefit foreign lands, relies on bureaucracy. And so, she has 2 chapters in there, one called Race Thinking Before Racism, and the next one called Race and Bureaucracy, in which she argues that the emergence of racism on the one hand and the rise of an imperialist bureaucracy on the other are what together allowed for and brought about a new fascist and totalitarian ideology. And that's where I think your turn towards immigration is actually somewhat inspired. I don't know if this is exactly what you meant by it or not, but it's how I'm reading it or hearing it, which is that I agree with you that immigration is, if you look all around the world, the rise of populisms and the rise of what's going on, what unites them everywhere is an anti-immigrant bias. But I would actually, here would I disagree with you. I don't think purity is what's driving it, although I'm not saying it's not involved at all. But I think the bureaucratization of an anti-immigrant and the way we deal with immigrants is where you can begin to see political organizations emerge that could have fascist overtones. I don't think it's an accident, therefore, Jack, that the groups that are in Portland and Chicago now are Border Control, ICE, and DA and Department of Homeland Security. They all come out of that immigration bureaucracy. And so I think that it's that bureaucratic mentality, and it's a mentality, Arendt says, in which you seek to govern people who are racially lower than you, right? And that's where the purity could come in. And therefore, you empower agencies to have power over people without responsibility and without democratic checks and balances, constitutional checks and balances, because you're just governing those people over there or those people trying to come here from over there. And you create a kind of irresponsibility which in the chapter on race and bureaucracy, she does a brilliant job. I mean, this is a chapter that's not talked about nearly enough in the book about how these bureaucracies actually celebrated their independence from the rule of law and their independence from constitutional and democratic checks and responsibility. And so I think you're right to turn us to immigration. You're right to turn us to imperialism. And what we're seeing in our current, interestingly enough, proto-nationalist instead of imperialist, bureaucratic engagement with the other of immigrants or refugees is the rise of a kind of proto-fascist, potentially, bureaucracy. One thing I'll say is to the first part of your question, that you and Stephen Greenleaf were saying that there may not be, or there's a question of whether there is a new fascist ideal or ideology. I would agree with that. I think that, and here's where I'd say, we have to understand not only the similarities with that period that Arendt's talking about, but also the differences. I don't think we're seeing a new imperialist world dominating ideology emerge. So I don't think we're seeing totalitarianism emerge. I do think we are seeing a cynical, nihilistic, complete abdication of ideals and a rise of kind of a nihilist power hungry grab, that anything that works to give us power is acceptable and accepted. And so, to me, what's driving our period is not an imperialist world dominating ideology of the types Arendt was talking about, but more of a kind of a nihilism that allows, that sort of wants to break the system apart and destroy the system more than develop a kind of world power system. That's my own reading of the moment. But
I'd just like to clarify something that maybe perhaps I wasn't too clear about, which is that in the work that we're reading now, which is Arendt in the 40s and 50s, actually in the 40s, still in the 40s, she speaks of the resistance movements during World War II. And she speaks of how the resistance movements are moving toward a kind of federation, that they're seeking a liberation, if you like, from the dominance of the nation state, which she sees falling apart anyway. So they're trying to take advantage of the collapse, if you like, of the nation state. And I think that that's a movement that has not stopped. I believe that, and it's one obviously to which I personally attach myself. But that's separate from what I'm trying to say here, which is that today's expression of imperialism is in fact the multinational imperialism, and there is a resistance to that, and it's an international resistance, and there are opportunists who take the energy of that resistance and try to pour it into fascist organization. And the way in which they do that is they claim to protect the nation state, which they declare as being under attack, right? And now they place the blame elsewhere. They use racism and anti-Semitism, particularly through the fight, the resistance to immigration, as a way of organizing people to get power.
Yeah.
And it's definitely, what's happening is we're seeing a grab for power by fascistic-minded parties and persons who are using the current situation to build, as you say, a different kind of bureaucracy, which doesn't really care about the nation that it serves.
That's exactly.
And that's her point about the Nazis. The Nazis didn't really care about Germany, but they appealed to German nationalism. And I see that that's what's happening here in America, and I also see it happening in countries around the world. That at the core of it is this international demonization of the immigrant.
I agree with that, Jack. I'm going to move on just because we're running out of time. We got a bunch of questions, but that's really helpful. Anita, you're up.
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of two seemingly unrelated points. The first thing is that from the perspective in the UK, I think we're seeing a lot more anti-Semitism than before. During the statue wars and the mass protests against the Black Lives Movement in central London, a number of the alt-right were using fascist salutes.
Anita, just hold on 1 second. I'm going to interrupt you. I'm hearing a loud whistle. I don't know if it's from you or someone else, but people mute yourself if you're not Anita. And let's see if we can let Anita talk. Go ahead, try it again.
Yeah, so the first thing is during the mass protests in central London against the statue wars, the alt-right did use Nazi salutes. The second point I would make is that the protocols that Arendt refers to are now being applied quite extravagantly on the internet. And the alt-right websites are linked to Holocaust denial sites. The same people are perpetuating them. Third thing I would say is that it's not always the anti-Semitism isn't. Sorry, is that mine that's making that noise?
I can't tell. But it might be, but
let me see.
Every time you speak, it comes back on.
If I turn my volume, is it still coming on?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll write it in the chat room.
Okay, but I mean, you want to just quickly finish the last point you were making?
Yeah, and I was going to say the other thing is there is a massive weeding out of anti-Semitism going on in the Labour Party that has actually tranched the Labour Party.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say is that on her idea of as fascism as an international movement, what a lot of people don't realize is the ideological founders of the apartheid South African state were educated in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. The apparatus of that state was erected from 1948. And it was specifically driven by a racist agenda, but you had an anti-Semitism running underneath it.
Thank you. That's really helpful, Anita. I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount of anti-Semitism coursing around the world right now. It's funny. I mean, we all have weird ways that we come across things like this, but right after President Trump was elected, a colleague, I mean, not at Bard, but a colleague in the world of mine, Danielle Allen, wrote a piece questioning him. It was not about race so much. It was just about him. And she's an African-American scholar now at Harvard. And, it was a good piece, but I happened to look at the comments for it. And 80% of the comments were calling her a kike this and a Jew, I mean, all sorts of anti-Semitic comments. She's not Jewish, she's Black. And that was where, for the first time, I sort of became aware of this confluence between the sort of white supremacist groups of anti-Semitism and racism, and I think you're seeing, and I think for a long time we saw racist acts underlined with an underlying anti-Semitic core. I think what Anita's pointing out, especially with the Labor Party and other places, is that one of the things that the president's election has done in the US and the populist support around the world is allowed both more racial acts of racism, but also more Jew hatred to enter the world in the last 3 or 4 years. And that's obviously a deeply well, tragic and horrific event on both sides. So thank you, Anita. Nancy, you're up.
Okay. Yeah, this Jack's comments, if I understood them correctly, might already illuminate this, but I'm still struggling with something. It's on page 145 in the Seeds of a Fascist International. It's about the destructiveness, the observation that the Nazis offered up Germany as a sacrifice to the future of fascism, and that the drive was to included a kind of destruction of Germany. And so I was just wondering, I've been trying to extrapolate from this to our times, as others are doing. And I'm trying to think about all the unraveling of constitutional checks and balances in our country, and whether that's part of a is that tied in your opinion, or anyone's opinion, about with this kind of nihilistic notion? And I just wanted to hear a little more on that, tied into this kind of day by day barrage coming from Trump and from some of the Republicans in the Senate toward a disrespect for foundational aspects of this country, of our Constitution, and so on.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And let me say, here's one of those situations where I'll be a little bit provocative. So I think that you're seeing this nihilism and this urge to destroy emerge both on the right and on parts of the left. My friend and colleague, Thomas Chatterton Williams, wrote about the way in which Richard Spencer, a far-right neo-Nazi, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, a far-left journalist, in his mind have a similar nihilist view of the United States as a racial country that is irretrievably and irredeemably racist and can't be helped. One doesn't have to agree with Thomas 100% on that, but there's no doubt that we, whether in Venezuela or in Hungary, you're seeing left-wing and right-wing nihilisms emerge that are tearing apart institutions. Now, the argument, and I think one of the things that's really scary right now is that while Trump and his main supporters probably are about 30% or 35% of the country, there's probably another 10 to 15% of the country who, on the left, have similarly kind of radical views that the country is basically gone down a road that is irredeemable and needs to be and it's worth risking everything to break it apart. If you put those two together, that's probably close to 50% of the American public that probably believes that this country is non-salvageable at this point. That's a scary situation to be in. And I think anyone who doesn't accept the real danger that we're in as a country and the world is not opening their eyes. I think that without a doubt there are large numbers of people in this country, on the left and the right, mostly on the right, but some on the left, who believe that the country is so evil and so corrupt and so decadent that destroying it would be better than keeping it and trying to reform it. That's what I mean by a kind of nihilistic fury. They see the whole, again, for different reasons, and there's different arguments. Some thinks it's a white supremacist country, some think it's become a multicultural country with no values. You get different views, but there are a lot of angry people, and we need to take that seriously. So yeah, I think that's partly that's the kind of vacuum that she was talking about that existed in Europe at this time.
Well, follow up is I wondered how watching, observing, reading about people dying from COVID fits. Is that like something that is that attitude of nihilism something that allows people to be watching these statistics and not really be troubled by not being troubled by them or not being alarmed or so on? In other words, is death through a pandemic then seen as part of this decline that's inevitable and that might have some kind of redemption at the end or something like that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a complicated one, because I think that goes both ways. On the one hand, you could make the argument you're making, if I understand you correctly, that life is so worthless, who cares? And we're at a point where people just don't care about life. They only care about profit. And I think that makes sense. On the other hand, if you don't think about profit, but at the beginning of the crisis, at least when we were in Italy and New York, where we weren't allowing people to see their loved ones in the hospital and we weren't allowing people to go to funerals, my worry was not about life versus profit, but it was about life versus meaning and life versus caring for individuals. And that in the hope of keeping everyone alive, we were prohibiting basic human needs for touching and attachment and mourning together. That to me was a dangerous trend at the time, and it came from a loss of understanding of the importance of human love and human attachment and human mourning and ritual. And I think that a lot of the medical establishment that imposed these rules just don't have a sense of the importance of that aspect of human life. So that was at least one side of it. Stephen, I know you had a bunch of questions at the beginning and you haven't gotten to, so you'll be the last question. We're running out of time, although I see now Daphne's also raised her hand. So Stephen, start. I'll see if I can get Daphne's question in. You there, Stephen?
I am, if you mean me.
Oh, Stephen Greenleaf.
Yeah, it's the other guy. Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, yeah, I'll pipe in, but let me pick up on immigration, because I think Jack's point is well taken, and it's an international phenomenon, and perhaps this identifies a weakness I've seen in Arendt's work and analysis, although I have to admit it's been decades since I read The Origins, but that is the underlying importance of economic dislocation in fueling these types of movements, both in the 1930s, 20s, and 30s, and today. There was an interesting article by Peter Turchin, who reminded his readers that a lot of the opposition to immigration comes from labor because of the pressure that immigrants put on wages. It was often the left that opposed immigration into the US as opposed to the right, because businesses wanted cheap labor, and cheap labor helped fuel American capitalism, especially in the period after the Civil War. So that, and in general, I would say Arendt doesn't analyze this perhaps as closely as she should, because I think that fuel, so it raises the question, would anti-Semitism, racism, and other such fevers rise but for these compelling economic dislocations that we're seeing now and saw in the past?
No, it's a good point. I think one of the things Arendt says at in the essay on power politics, right, is that one of the problems with the book that she's talking about is that they actually think economics matters, and that in the end nobody cares. She says the point is that the author overlooks the point, and that all important for modern politics is that nobody cares about the economic consequences of this. And so first of all, Arendt does often talk about economic dislocation in the Origins and other places, but not nearly as much. And so I'll double down on that and say, Stephen, I don't think this is economic. I mean, I think you're right. Labor has traditionally been against widespread immigration, but what we're seeing right now is not a labor-driven movement. And all the studies that I've read, at least, have shown that this is not an economically driven movement. It is now. I think you're not entirely wrong. I mean, your point is not entirely wrong, because I think part of what it is driven by is a sense that white people are being displaced. There's a theory that comes out of France called the Great Replacement. We had a very interesting panel on it at the conference last year. And it'll be in the new Hannah Arendt journal. That will be that whole panel will be reprinted in the journal, and it's fascinating. But I think there is a strong sense among many white people now in Europe and here that their way of life is being threatened, and that they're being replaced, and there's an economic component of it, but it's less usually that they're economically suffering, and more that there's just a sense that they're going to lose in the game.
Well, I think that's right, and I'm not necessarily arguing that there's a cause and effect, but it's more of a matter of round up the usual suspects. Right. That is to say, immigrants, anti-Semitism, racism. I mean, that these pressures are felt in the decline of parts of rural America, even among middle class people feeling that kind of displacement, economic pressures and cultural displacement that are part of fueling this, not in a direct cause and effect way, but in that general perception that makes the effects more widespread than they are in a strictly economic sense.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, Arendt in Origins, when I teach Origins, it's like she goes from economic argument to political argument, economic argument, political argument. But there's no doubt that in the end, the political arguments carry more weight for her than economic arguments. And I think I think that's true. I mean, whether you think that's a failing or a benefit, I think she's proven correct on that. I don't think economic arguments carry the day almost ever, but that's certainly something we can challenge her and should. Daphne, you get the last question.
Okay, I'm usually brief. I just wanted to respond to something that you were talking to Anita about, and that is the rise of anti-Semitism in the UK, which I've been following. Certainly the attempts by the New Labour leader to get rid of some of what he called were the anti-Semites in the Labour Party. But the accusation of anti-Semitism has become very prevalent and leveled at people in the States as well who object to Israel's policies. And so it becomes somewhat devoid of meaning, because I, as a Jewish Israeli, have been labeled an anti-Semite many times because of criticism at the Israeli government. So it really works very well. I don't know if it's rampant anti-Semitism, but people have been calling Biden an anti-Semitism because he expressed the possibility of considering the Palestinians. These are things that become explosive, but somewhat devoid of the kind of meaning that Hannah Arendt has so, I think, well articulated. And it pits those who perhaps deserve the term against those who are placed into this trap, which is inescapable. It's really more a slogan to divide people. And whilst anti-Semitism in the real sense, in the Hannah Arendtian sense, is a very big concern, it doesn't deviate to much from racism in general. So that was just the point I wanted to make. Thank you.
No, you're right. And I'm sure some of you know, the Arendt Center is currently being sued by the US government for anti-Semitism because we allowed the Students for Justice in Palestine to protest at the conference last year. And we're fighting a lawsuit right now with the US government, accusing us of anti-Semitism for allowing that protest to happen. So these things.
Yes, I was there. I saw that.
I know. I appreciate that. Just thank you all. Reminder, if you haven't yet joined as a member, please, this is our summer membership drive. We'd love you to join the Arendt Center. Go to our website and join. There's great joint memberships that we have. And thank you all. Another great week. And enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. We'll see you a week from today. Bye-bye.